On a recent episode of her show, Rachel Big Boy Maddow, a propagandist masquerading as a journalist, actually advocated for stripping a political candidate she opposes, Donald Trump, of his First Amendment protected right to freedom of speech.
In the saga of the multiple criminal trials that are ahead for former president and Republican leading presidential candidate Donald Trump, one major thing we're waiting on right now, could happen at any time, is news on whether the federal judge overseeing Trump's case in D.C., the one about him trying to overturn the election, will that judge grant the prosecutor's request for an order that restricts the kinds of statements that Trump can make about that trial, so as to not prejudice the jury pool, so as not to intimidate witnesses. It's very striking. We're waiting on that order for the judge right now. But, you know, in their request for that order from the judge, prosecutors had to give examples to the court of some of the times that Trump's overheated public statements have led his followers to commit violence or to threaten violence on his behalf.
Donald Trump is the leading candidate of the Republican Party, and he is presumed innocent until convicted in a court of law. What Rachel Maddow is advocating for is allowing the current regime to use a prosecuting agency that it controls to accuse a political rival of a crime, and then deny its political rival the opportunity to use his First Amendment protected right to freedom of speech to defend himself. It appears Joe Biden's Department of Justice and Rachel Maddow are not concerned about Trump affecting the jury pool. They are concerned about him affecting the voting pool that they are trying to prejudice against him.
If public life, public service, even just regular citizen participation in regular politics is suffused with threats of violence now,
like having DOJ raid your home and charge you with made-up crimes?
one of the things that for sure does is it forces regular people out of politics and out of public service. Right? It is common sense. If politics and public service are being made into something that is quite literally dangerous, then in the normal course of events, normal people will steer clear. Right? That's part of why we have a protected, right to associate with others, even for political purposes in this country, right? You ought to be able to gather with others. You ought to be able to assemble. You have the right to assemble peaceably, to seek the redress of grievances. Why do we have a right to peaceably assemble? So that people can assemble peaceably, so that you don't feel like trying to redress your grievances with the government is something that's going to expose you to physical danger, either from the government or from anyone else. We protect protesters. We protect people assembling peaceably to say their piece, so that we can all peacefully say our piece, so our government will be accountable to us, so our government will continue to adapt to the needs and the wants and the voice of the people. What we have now is an atmosphere of ultra-right-wing political violence and threat, which doesn't only affect the individual politicians and civil servants and poll workers and law enforcement officials who are being directly targeted by Trump supporters. It has a systemic effect too, right? Systemically over time, it thins out, it hollows out the public sphere and government. So it's no longer for anybody. It's only for the brave and the militant and those who themselves are willing to either abide threats of violence or issue them themselves. And that is not the kind of democracy we are. That is not what we are supposed to be. We are supposed to have a rollicking free press. We are supposed to have the constitutionally protected freedom to associate, freedom to assemble, including for political reasons, for redress of grievances from the government. We are supposed to have a vibrant, rollicking civil society. We're supposed to have no barrier to entry, participatory democracy at every level, from student government to school board to city hall to your locally elected dog catcher and alderman and state rep and president.
Notice how corrupt and manipulative Rachel Maddow actually is. She mentions freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press, all while carefully omitting any mention of the First Amendment that protects these things. She did this deliberately, because she is attacking Donald Trump's First Amendment protected right to freedom of speech.
If participation in public life at every level instead is cowed by people wielding guns and threats of mob violence and death threats and intimidation of witnesses and the doxing of grand jurors and all the rest of it, then at a fundamental level, we are just doing it wrong. We are doing it, in fact, like way too much of the rest of the world does it. And the fact that we haven't been that, the fact that we have been different, the fact that we have been a place where government is by and for the people is, at least until now, why so much of the world has been aspiring to come here when they can.
And then the Democrats lost a presidential election. And we saw censorship under the guise of fact-checking. We saw a president silenced by a tech platform. We saw reporting on Hunter Biden's laptop forbidden. We saw people silenced when they questioned vaccine efficacy or election integrity. And here we see a representative of the press trying to deny a political candidate his First Amendment protected right to freedom of speech. Big Boy's attack on Donald Trump is not an attack on one man's right to speak. It is an attack on everyone's ability to hear.
Last week, we saw Republicans in the state of Wisconsin fire the widely praised, technocratic, nonpartisan administrator of elections in that crucial swing state. Because heaven forbid we hold on to free and fair, technocratically sound and boring election administration in this country, real small d democracy. Heaven forbid we hold on to that when instead we could trade it in for garbage, untrusted elections like everybody else has in so many parts of the rest of the world.
Listening to Rachel Maddow, it almost seems like she believes elections can be stolen through voter fraud. This is a particularly strange position for her to take, since she supports the party that advocates for no voter ID, that predominantly votes by a mail-in ballot, and that actually mailed out unsolicited mail-in ballots using COVID-19 as an excuse. It's almost like she's claiming that if a Democrat wins an election, in which Democrats controlled the electoral process, then there's no voter fraud and no possibility of it. But if the Republicans win an election and control the electoral process, then it must have been due to voter fraud. You know, it almost seems like Rachel Maddow and her allies believe Trump is going to win the next presidential election, and they're positioning themselves to contest that election, or maybe even stage an insurrection. Rachel Maddow is a professional liar, and her show is a one-woman assault on truth, beauty, and goodness. Don't listen to Big Boy. It's just going to make you stupid.